Okay, let's unpack this. We are about to embark on a really deep dive into Jimmy Carter.
Yeah, Jimmy Carter, he's, still such a complex figure. Yeah. Decades later, lots of reevaluation going on.
Absolutely. He kind of burst onto the scene at this very specific moment, right? Promising something totally new, integrity, transparency.
Very much the outsider. Deliberately so, especially after, well, all the national trauma and cynicism of that time.
But then his time in office, it was just marked by these challenges that were, frankly, overwhelming.
It's a striking contrast, isn't it? You've got these really notable policy achievements on one hand.
And then these crises that felt almost, I don't know, insurmountable on the other. It's a painful mix sometimes.
And that's exactly what our source material today helps us dig into, in a really layered way. We've got some solid historical stuff.
Right.
Insights from the White House Historical Association that gives us the basic biofacts, policy points, and the Miller Center at UVA, too.
Okay, so biographical details, key events, historical context, the sort of scholarly view on his legacy.
Exactly. Yeah. That gives us the foundation, the what happened.
Okay, the established history, the facts, the figures. Got it. But then there's this other source we have.
Ah, yes, the narrative piece. Jimmy Carter, the outsider and the unseen hand.
And this one feels different. It's less about just listing events, more about interpreting the forces, maybe.
Precisely. It frames his whole presidency through these ideas like unseen adversaries, a global game of shadows. It keeps asking if there was more going on behind the scenes.
You mean beyond just the obvious political or economic stuff?
Yeah. It pushes us to think about, were there deeper currents, less obvious things influencing events. It adds this kind of speculative layer.
Which is fascinating. So, okay, our mission today. Weave these threads together. We want to get beyond just a timeline for you.
Right. Build a fuller picture using all these documents. Draw out the key nuggets.
We'll look at who Carter was, how he even got to the presidency, those unique circumstances.
Then dive into his domestic policies, the economy he was grappling with.
And compare the historical facts with those questions from the narrative source about, the nature of that crisis.
Then there's his foreign policy. Very distinctive. Major achievements, but big challenges too.
And again, we'll contrast the historical record with this idea of maybe unseen forces at play.
We have to talk about the crises that really define the end of his term.
Oh, yeah. And then his post-presidency, which is just remarkable, really. It's led to this whole reevaluation of his legacy.
Totally. So it's about getting beneath the headlines for you, understanding the layers in these materials.
They're seeing why this era, this really unique figure, why it still matters for understanding American leadership today.
We're here to guide you through it, connect the dots between the sources, maybe offer some deeper insights.
Think of it like we're exploring this complex story together, sifting through the evidence from these different sources. So let's settle in. Time for our deep dive into the outsider and the overwhelmed.
Okay, so Jimmy Carter, the ultimate political outsider.
Yeah.
And that whole identity seems completely tied to his beginnings. Plains, Georgia.
Yeah, where does that story really start, according to our sources?
Well, both the White House Historical Association, let's just call it WHHA, and the Miller Center lay out the basics. James Earl Carter Jr., born in Plains, October Wars, 1924.
Okay.
And the sources always highlight these key things from his upbringing. Peanut farming, obviously. That wasn't just a job. It was central to his family, his image later on.
Right, the peanut farmer president.
Exactly. And local politics were in the background, but not national stuff. And a very deeply held Baptist faith that really informed his values, his public persona.
And those elements, they became the raw material for that outsider brand, didn't they? Someone totally unconnected to D.C. power, grounded in rural America.
But his path wasn't always the farm. He had this whole other track with his education. The WHHA notes he went to the Naval Academy in Annapolis, graduated in 46.
1946. And wasn't that the same year he got married?
Yeah, same year. Huge personal milestone marrying Rosalind Smith.
Yeah.
Their partnership became such a defining part of his public life.
Yeah.
And the sources list their 4 kids, Jack, Chip, Jeff, and Amy Lynn. So, a growing family alongside this career taking shape.
And the Navy career took him away from Georgia for a while.
It did. WHHA says 7 years as a naval officer, submarines, nuclear power.
Yeah.
He even worked under Admiral Rickover.
Wow, Rickover. That's a serious background. Discipline, tech, high-stakes stuff. Pretty different from farming.
Totally different.
Yeah.
But then his father died, and he returned to Plains. That seems like such a crucial decision.
A conscious choice to go back to his roots, yeah.
Absolutely pivotal.
Yeah.
And that return Basically launched his political career in Georgia. The sources confirm he got elected state senator in '62.
Okay, state senator first.
Served 2 terms there. Then he aimed higher, ran for governor, didn't make it the first time in '66, but then won it in 1970, 8 years after starting in the state legislature.
And as governor, he started getting noticed outside Georgia.
Yeah, the WHHA points this out. He was seen as part of this, new generation of Southern governors. He talked a lot about government efficiency,
Yeah.
a theme he carried later. And, really importantly, he pushed for removing racial discrimination.
Which, in the South at that time, was a pretty big deal. Shows he wasn't afraid of tough social issues early on.
Definitely. It helped build this profile as a reformer, someone serious about cleaning up government. Made him look different from the old guard.
Which kind of set the stage for that improbable presidential run.
Exactly. WHHA says he announced in December '74 and calls him virtually unknown nationally. It's wild to think about now.
Yeah, launching from almost nowhere. But that obscurity became part of the appeal, didn't it?
And the timing was just perfect. Both the historical sources and that unseen hand narrative really stressed this. It was right after Vietnam, right after Watergate.
Yeah, people were just so cynical, so distrustful of Washington.
So the WHHA notes, Democratic voters welcomed a fresh choice. And Carter was definitely that, untainted by all the scandals.
He picked Walter Mondale as his running mate, right? Minnesota senator. More of a traditional liberal.
Yeah, a strategic move, broaden the appeal, add some Washington experience to the ticket, which Carter obviously lacked.
And the campaign itself sounds like it was pretty smart. Grassroots stuff, really playing up the outsider angle.
Definitely. And the WHHA mentions he debated President Ford 3 times. Those debates were absolutely critical.
Right, put the unknown guy on the same stage as the president. Let people see him directly.
Introduced himself, his ideas, his whole persona to the country.
And it worked. WHHA says he won 297 electoral votes to Ford's 241. Pretty solid victory, ending the Nixon-Ford era.
Okay, so now, this is where that outsider and the unseen hand source really brings in its unique framing.
Right, the narrative angle.
It talks about him emerging from the quiet fields of Plains, this unlikely presidential candidate, really leans into the unknown outsider challenging the political establishment thing.
Says he captivated a nation tired of cynicism, promising truth and transparency, which lines up with the history, the post-Watergate mood.
But then it asks this really interesting question, kind of the core of its perspective. How did this former naval officer, this humble peanut farmer, bypass the traditional power structures to seize the White House?
It acknowledges the obvious stuff, its authenticity, the national mood, but then it speculates, right?
Yeah, it asks, was his rise a testament to pure authenticity, or were there unseen currents? Like maybe just this desperate need for a clean slate after Watergate paved the way.
That's compelling. How does that square with the other sources? The historical ones definitely confirm that context, right? The disappointment, the desire for change.
Oh, absolutely. That desperate need for a clean slate. The WHHA and Miller Center descriptions of the post-Watergate vibe totally support that. The conditions were right for an outsider.
So the visible forces were clearly massive. The unseen currents idea from that narrative source.
Yeah.
It's asking us to think about something maybe less tangible.
Exactly. Like, was there this collective, maybe subconscious yearning in the country for someone fundamentally different? Someone not part of the system that seemed broken.
Was the desperation for a fresh start just so deep it created this opening that, maybe standard political analysis wouldn't predict?
Precisely. The sources together show his authentic image plus the national mood were huge. The unseen hand source just adds this layer of inquiry, suggesting maybe that's not the whole story. Were there deeper shifts, harder to measure, that made his specific rise possible then?
And that outsider status, his great strength in the campaign, maybe that also carried the seeds of problems later on, once he was actually in office.
Well, yeah. Coming in without those deep ties in a Washington Congress, the bureaucracy, even parts of his own party that could make governing way harder.
It's a paradox, isn't it? The unseen hand source kind of implies his disconnection got him elected.
But governing, as the historical sources show, means working with those structures. Not having those relationships could become a real obstacle once the campaigning stopped and the policy work started.
So his rise seems like this fascinating mix, his genuine background, the huge historical forces after Vietnam and Watergate.
And maybe, like that narrative source suggests, just this underlying desperate need for something completely different, creating an unpredictable opening.
The challenge then was going to be turning that winning outsider energy into effective leadership inside the system he ran against.
Okay, so he gets into the Oval Office,
Hmm.
and he's carrying all these expectations, that big promise he made. WHHA mentions his pledge for a government as competent, as compassionate, as good as the American people.
That's a powerful statement. Very values-driven, trying to restore faith, right?
Incredibly high expectations,
Yeah.
yeah. Especially given what he inherited. And WHHA immediately says he found it difficult to meet them. The era was already full of rising costs, inflation, this sense of crisis.
The economy was tough right from the start.
Brutal. And all the sources paint this really consistent picture. WHHA talks about continuing economic woes of inflation and unemployment. The unseen hand source uses rampant inflation, high unemployment.
So not just a little blip, real economic pain for a lot of people.
Yeah, WHHA gives specifics. Inflation and interest rates were at near record highs. That combo is poison, because fighting inflation usually means raising rates.
Which slows the economy, increases unemployment, a
Right.
catch-22.
Right, and WHHA explicitly says his efforts to reduce inflation caused a recession. Shows you the tough trade-offs he was facing.
And the unseen hand source adds that really vivid image. An energy crisis that brought gas lines to America.
Oh yeah, people remember that. Cars lined up for blocks, rationing. It became this potent symbol of the frustration, the vulnerability.
So in this grim environment, what did he actually do? What policies did he try?
Well, despite the headwinds, WHHA notes that by the end, he could point to some positives. An increase of nearly 8 million jobs, a decrease in the budget deficit as a percentage of GNP.
So some positive stats, even if the feeling was struggle.
Right, and he made energy a huge priority. Saw the link to the economy, national security. WHHA says he proclaimed a national energy policy.
And he deregulated oil prices.
Yeah, deregulated domestic petroleum prices. The idea was to boost domestic production, rely less on foreign oil, increase supply.
He also pushed for efficiency, deregulation elsewhere, too.
Civil service reform, trying to make the bureaucracy more efficient, and demanding deregulation of trucking and airlines.
Who are those industries?
The thinking then was deregulation would boost competition, lower prices for consumers, cut red tape.
Okay. And environmentally.
Big achievements there. WHHA notes a major expansion of the national park system, protecting 103 million acres of Alaskan lands. That was huge for conservation.
Landmark stuff. He also created new government departments.
Yeah, reorganized things, created the Department of Education, bringing federal education programs together, and the Department of Energy, centralizing energy policy. Makes sense, given the crisis.
What about people? Did he change the face of government appointments?
Significantly, WHHA highlights this. He appointed record numbers of women, African Americans, and Hispanics to federal positions, including judges, making government look more like the country.
But even with all that policy activity, the feeling in the country was still stuck, kind of adrift.
That seems to be the consensus, which led to his famous speech. Miller Center calls it the Crisis of Confidence speech, July 79.
A malaise speech, though he didn't actually use that word, right?
Exactly. The unseen hand source mentions that too, but it captures the core idea. He acknowledged a deeper societal malaise. It wasn't just about the numbers. It was about a loss of confidence, purpose.
And here's where the unseen hand source comes back in, framing that whole economic struggle and mood.
Right. It asks these big questions. Was this purely an economic downturn, just a cycle or bad policy? Or was it something deeper, more profound, almost spiritual?
Suggesting maybe the roots of the problem went beyond economics.
Yeah. And it pushes even further, speculating. Were unseen forces, perhaps global shifts in power or hidden economic manipulations, beyond the reach of any single president, orchestrating this period of national doubt?
Whoa. So questioning the causes and even the controllability of the problems he faced.
Exactly. The historical sources give us the facts: inflation, unemployment, energy crisis, his policies. But this narrative source wonders, were there bigger, less visible things going on? Global shifts, even like deliberate hidden manipulations, things no president could really fix.
It really challenges you, the listener, to think about the limits of presidential power, doesn't it? Especially with global economics or like that source hints, maybe hidden agendas.
It takes the real economic pain the other sources document and adds this layer of possibility. Maybe the fight wasn't just against market forces, but something less visible, maybe more powerful.
So why should you listening today care about 70s economics?
Because so many of those issues are still with us. Inflation, energy costs, debates about regulation. They haven't got away.
And his policies had lasting effects, right? Depth of energy, education, those environmental protections.
Absolutely. And that basic challenge he faced, leading a nation through tough economic times, managing expectations, trying to sell solutions that might hurt now but help later, that's timeless for any leader.
The sources show him really grappling with it against this backdrop of concrete problems and maybe, as one source suggests, these larger, fuzzier forces.
So domestically,
Mm.
intense economic pressure, questions about the national direction. Carter pushed major policies, made big institutional changes, but faced this deep malaise and potentially struggled against forces maybe no president could fully control.
Okay, let's shift focus from domestic struggles to the world stage. Carter's foreign policy. It felt really different, didn't it?
Very distinctive approach, yeah. Set him apart from Nixon. Forward. The WHA pinpoints his central focus: Carter's championship of human rights.
Which was a big shift. For years, U.S. policy was more about Cold War strategy, right? Supporting allies even if their human rights records weren't great.
Exactly. Real politics often won out over ideals. It was about stability, anti-communism.
And the outsider in the unseen hand source calls Carter's move a radical departure from the Cold War's cynical pragmatism.
Right. It says he boldly placed human rights at the center and frames this within what it calls a global game of shadows.
That framing immediately signals tension, doesn't it? Potential risks.
Absolutely. Because championing human rights globally means criticizing other governments, publicly pressuring them about how they treat their own people.
Yeah.
That's guaranteed to provoke a reaction.
And the unseen hand source jumps right into that, asking, did this moral crusade inadvertently provoke powerful adversaries, both foreign and domestic? It wonders about unseen intelligence battles, covert retaliations, or hidden agendas by those who benefited from the old order. Were people subtly undermining him?
See, this has that speculative layer again. The historical sources confirm the visible reaction. WOHHA says the Soviets gave it a cold reception, saw it as interference.
But it also inspired people, right? Dissidents?
Yeah, WHHA notes that too. It inspired dissidents throughout the Soviet Empire, gave hope to people fighting authoritarianism. The unseen hand source doesn't argue with that, but it asks about the hidden stuff. Were foreign intel agencies actively working against him because of this? Were there people inside the U.S., maybe Cold War pragmatists, who thought his focus was naive and worked against his agenda quietly?
It really highlights how hard it is to run a values-based foreign policy in a world that's often about power and secrets. That tension between ideals and messy reality seems key to Carter's experience.
Definitely. But even with that opposition, the historical sources list some truly major diplomatic wins during his term.
Like the Panama Canal Treaties, WHHA says he prevailed in a tough fight to get those ratified.
Oh yeah, that was hugely controversial at home. Took a lot of political capital, handing control of the canal back to Panama by '99. Carter saw it as correcting a historical wrong, improving relations in Latin America.
And then there was China, establishing full diplomatic relations. That was massive.
Monumental shift, January 1st, 1979. Nixon started it, but Carter finalized it. Switching official recognition from Taiwan to mainland China had huge global effects.
He also worked on arms control with the Soviets.
Yeah, completed negotiation of the SALT II Treaty in '79. Trying to limit nuclear weapons. Crucial effort, even though the Senate ratification got derailed later by the Afghanistan invasion. But the negotiation itself was a key achievement listed by WHHA.
But the one everyone remembers, the big one, is Camp David. All the sources mention that.
Absolutely. The Camp David Accords. WHHA gives the basics. Peace agreement between Egypt and Israel, hammered out over 12 days of talks at Camp David in '78.
And the Miller Center adds that it was Sadat of Egypt and Begin of Israel signing it September 17, 1978, after 12 days of secret negotiations.
That's secrecy, the intensity of those 12 days away from everything.
Yeah.
It underscores how delicate it was.
The unseen hand source calls it historic. Almost miraculous, right? Acknowledges how unlikely it seemed. Credits Carter's negotiating skill, too.
Yeah, extraordinary skill as a negotiator. But then that source applies its framing again, calls it the Camp David Enigma, marked by miracles and unspoken tensions.
So celebrating the outcome, but asking us to look behind the scenes, at the human drama.
Exactly. It asks about those 13 days in seclusion. What untold hours of psychological warfare, what profound personal sacrifices, and what unspoken tensions truly defined that time.
Were there moments it almost fell apart, saved by unseen interventions or a desperate hidden plea?
It doesn't challenge the fact that the accords were signed. The historical sources confirm that, but it adds this dramatic, speculative feel. Imagine the pressure on those leaders cooped up together, the near collapses, and maybe, as it hints, these critical interventions, moments of sheer will, personal breakthroughs, maybe even unknown external pressures that kept it going.
It's a good reminder, isn't it? Even these big historical moments, the treaties and handshakes, they're built on intense, private human struggles, some parts we might never fully know.
Right.
So why do these foreign policy things still matter for you today?
Well, Camp David fundamentally changed the Middle East. First peace treaty between Israel and an Arab nation. Its effects still shape the region.
And the whole debate about human rights and foreign policy, that's still front and center, isn't it? When and how should the U.S. pressure other countries? What are the costs?
Still a huge question. And the basic challenges Carter faced balancing ideals with geopolitics, superpower rivalries, and maybe, like one source suggests, hidden resistance. Those are timeless for any leader on the world stage.
So the sources show him pursuing this distinct moral vision, getting these undeniable breakthroughs.
While possibly, as one source hints, facing subtle, unseen opposition in this really complex global game.
Yeah, presidency with ambitious ideals, historic wins like Camp David, but also maybe shadowed by forces working against him.
Okay, so despite those big achievements we just talked about, foreign policy, Environment Carter's final year in office just seems dominated by crisis. It felt like everything was piling on.
Yeah, the WHHA puts it bluntly. Events seemed to conspire against him. That feeling was real, inside and outside the White House. One big event was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, right? December 79.
Huge. Changed the whole geopolitical game, ended détente, killed SALT II ratification, brought back Cold War tensions, apparently caught the administration off guard too.
But the crisis that really defined that period, the one everyone remembers, was Iran.
The Iran hostage crisis, yeah.
Yeah.
All the sources point to this as just critical. A prolonged national nightmare.
WHHA lays out the basics. Revolutionaries in Iran overthrew the Shah, then seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking 52 American hostages. November 4th, 1979.
And they wouldn't let him go.
Hmm.
The unseen hand source calls it the defining nightmare of Carter's presidency. It emphasizes how long it lasted.
444 days. Agonizing.
Right, and WHHA points out they were released literally the day Carter left office, January 20, 1981, as Reagan was being inaugurated.
Wow. So for over a year, those images of hostages dominated the news, a constant reminder of American helplessness.
Exactly. The unseen hand source talks about the impact. Blindfolded Americans, the public humiliation, and then the failed rescue attempt in April 80. That was just devastating, crippled the administration's image.
And here's where that unseen hand source brings in its specific lens again. It frames it not just as a diplomatic failure, but as a nation held captive by unseen powers.
Okay, so going beyond just the visible events again.
Yeah. It asks, was this merely a diplomatic failure, just couldn't negotiate a release? Or were there unseen forces at play, international actors or domestic enemies, manipulating the crisis for their own geopolitical gain?
So essentially asking if someone was using the crisis to hurt Carter.
Right, effectively holding his presidency hostage, too. It adds this layer of suspicion, complexity. The historical sources document the crisis, the attempts to solve it, the political damage, that's all clear.
But this narrative source wonders, was it just the natural outcome of the Iranian Revolution? Or were other forces, maybe other countries, maybe domestic rivals, deliberately interfering, maybe prolonging it because they knew it was killing him politically?
It suggests Carter wasn't just fighting the hostage takers, but maybe hidden actors using the crisis against him.
It takes that undeniable pain and frustration of the hostage crisis and injects this really unsettling possibility of deliberate hidden manipulation, making it even worse.
And while all this is happening internationally, the economy at home is still terrible, right?
Yeah. WHHA notes Americans were still suffering from brutal inflation and unemployment through 1980. So huge crises on both fronts, foreign and domestic, at the same time.
That combination. It just proved too much politically.
Seems so. WHA says the national frustration culminated with Carter's landslide defeat by Ronald Reagan in November 1980.
And the Miller Center's take on that, their scholarly assessment.
They say his presidency is often remembered for the events that overwhelmed it, captures that feeling of being swamped by forces beyond his control.
They also point to the difference in style, right? Carter's honest but gloomy outlook versus Reagan's telegenic optimism.
Yeah. Voters strongly rejected Carter's style in favor of Reagan's. That Miller Center view focusing on the overwhelming events and the contrast in style, a bit different from the unseen hand source, emphasizing potential hidden manipulation, behind those events.
But both perspectives end up in the same place. The challenges in that final year were immense and led to his defeat.
Yeah, the hostage crisis, the Soviet invasion, the bad economy. It was just too much for the administration to overcome in the eyes of voters who wanted change.
So, after a presidency like that, ending in such a tough defeat, you might expect someone to just withdraw. But Carter, that's not what happened at all, is it?
Not even close. Our sources show something really extraordinary about his life after the White House. WHHA says, yeah, he was stung by his loss, obviously. But then he starts this second act.
That transforms everything. WHHA says many people have called him the best former president in history.
That's quite a statement. And it points to the incredible work he did. He didn't just retire. He built the Carter Center in Atlanta.
And what does the Carter Center focus on?
WHHA lists it. Conflict resolution, supervising democratic elections abroad, and combating disease. This wasn't just talk, it was hands-on work, often in really difficult places.
And the Habitat for Humanity work, that's become iconic.
Totally. WHA specifically mentions him building homes through Habitat for Humanity, doing that direct service work through his 90s. That image, a former president hammering nails well into old age, it's incredibly powerful.
A real contrast to the usual post-presidency.
Absolutely. And his global efforts got recognized. WHA notes he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002 for such efforts.
Only the third U.S. president to win it after Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. That's big.
Huge acknowledgement. And the Miller Center adds other things, like co-chairing that commission on election reform with Gerald Ford in 2001.
Wow, working with Ford, the man he defeated. That says something about him, bipartisan work on a key issue.
Yeah, commitment beyond just politics. And interestingly, the Miller Center notes they started their first ever oral history project with his administration right after he left office in '81.
So even then, historians knew his presidency, despite the difficulties, was important to document.
Seems like it. And the Miller Center's overall assessment of his legacy now, looking back over the last couple of decades, it's much more nuanced.
How so?
It says there's been wider recognition that Carter, despite a lack of experience in D.C., confronted several huge problems with steadiness, courage, and idealism. It acknowledges how tough his problems were and his principled approach.
They also credit him and Ford with something else.
Yeah, with restoring the balance to the constitutional system after the excesses of the Johnson and Nixon imperial presidency. So an important institutional legacy too: transparency, limiting executive power, working with Congress, reasserting checks and balances.
Okay, let's bring the unseen hand source back one last time. How does it frame this amazing second act?
It calls his post-presidency remarkable. Notes he became a respected elder statesman, often critical of later presidents. And it frames it with this question: a prophet in the wilderness.
Connecting his later work back to his time in office.
Exactly. It uses his later role to pose these fundamental questions, challenging you, the listener, to rethink his whole presidency.
Like asking, was his earlier presidency simply ahead of its time? A prophet whose warnings about energy or human rights or confidence were just ignored back then.
Right. Suggesting maybe the nation wasn't ready, which led to his problems.
Or the alternative question it poses: did his time in office just reveal a deeper truth about the intractable problems facing America? Problems maybe no president could solve.
Yeah, it's suggesting maybe it wasn't just his leadership, but the sheer difficulty of the issues themselves. Systemic problems, deep conflicts, the limits of presidential power.
Those questions really make you look back differently, don't they? Beyond just blaming him for the crises, asking if the issues were just fundamentally harder, or if unseen factors blocked his potentially prophetic ideas back then.
What really stands out is the consistency in his values, though. His post-presidency work on peace, human rights, helping people, it directly mirrors the ideals he tried to bring to the White House.
Suggests a deep, unwavering commitment, even if the platform changed dramatically after he lost.
Yeah, so connecting this back to you listening, what does his post-presidency show us? It really redefines being a former president, doesn't it? Sets this model of sustained, active, global engagement on specific goals. Shows you can have huge impact outside the traditional power structure.
And his dedication, building houses into his 90s? It says so much about his character, his values.
Definitely. Suggests his commitment to service was the driving force all along. And arguably, he achieved more global recognition and influence after his presidency than during it.
It's this incredibly powerful second act that has totally reshaped how we see that difficult first act in the White House.
Okay, so let's try to pull these threads together from our deep dive into Carter. We traced his unique path, right? from Plains, Georgia, this compelling outsider.
Emerging when the country desperately wanted authenticity, a break from the past.
Yeah, we looked at the really tough domestic scene he inherited. Economic pain, inflation, the energy crisis.
Talked about his policies, some real results, but couldn't shake that national malaise. And we touched on that source, asking about unseen economic forces or maybe just intractable problems.
Then his very distinct foreign policy. Bold focus on human rights. Huge wins like Camp David, normalizing relations with China.
But also framed by that one source as this complex global game of shadows, maybe with unseen resistance to his idealism.
And his presidency ending amidst these defining crises, especially the Iran hostage crisis, alongside the economy in Afghanistan, leading to that landslide defeat.
Leaving that initial public memory, as Miller Center noted, of a presidency just overwhelmed by events.
But then, that incredible transformation after the White House, the Carter Center, Habitat, global humanitarian work, the Nobel Prize.
Which led to this major historical reevaluation, prompting those questions about whether he was a prophet in the wilderness or if his struggles showed the limits of the presidency itself.
What's really cool is how the different sources give us these layers. The WHA and Miller Center provide the factual framework that dates policies, outcomes, the scholarly view.
What happened?
Right. And then the unseen hand narrative, it doesn't contradict the facts, but it layers on these questions, these interpretations.
Yeah.
Hints at hidden dynamics, systemic forces, maybe manipulations visible or unseen, complicating the straightforward history.
So through these different lenses, Carter emerges as, well, not simple. A man of deep integrity, high ideals, clearly.
Yeah, a leader grappling with incredibly complex forces, economic, geopolitical, societal, forces that were obvious, but also, as one source makes us wonder, maybe influenced by things hidden in the shadows.
So hopefully, by diving into these specific sources with us, you've gotten a richer, more nuanced picture of this really pivotal, challenging time in American history.
And of a president whose story, the difficulties in office, his unprecedented response to defeat keeps getting reevaluated, understood in deeper ways.
His whole life, really farm, presidency, global, humanitarian, especially through these different source perspectives, it forces you to think about leadership itself, doesn't it? Especially when facing huge problems, maybe forces beyond anyone's control.
Absolutely. Which brings us to a final thought for you to mull over. Building on everything we've discussed today, challenge, leadership, legacy, the forces shaping history.
Reflecting on all the difficulties Carter faced, the clear economic and geopolitical crises, the historical sources document, plus those challenges framed by one source as potentially influenced by subtle, unseen forces or manipulations. What does his presidency, its struggles, and its achievements actually teach us about the inherent complexities, maybe the limitations of leadership in this deeply interconnected, often opaque world?
And maybe just as important, does his extraordinary post-presidency offer a different, perhaps more enduring model for how significant principled impact can be made, even completely outside the traditional centers of political power?